listening to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network, the nonprofit organization that strives to address the staggering disparity in resource availability for individuals suffering from mental health disorders, processing disorders, addictions, trauma healing, and sexual identity challenges. Together, we strive to end the stigma associated with these challenges so that true healing can begin. Welcome back to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network. I'm your host, Ange, and I welcome you to episode number 14. Today, we welcome Dr. Gabriel Constans, author of A Brave Year, 52 Weeks Being Mindful. Dr. Constans is a novelist, screenwriter, journalist, counselor, teacher, and parent. He has written for numerous magazines and newspapers throughout North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and published 14 books. He has worked as a grief and trauma counselor and teacher of mindfulness in a variety of situations and environments, most notably with local and international nonprofit health organizations, such as in hospice centers, coroner's offices, hospitals, state prisons, the R.O.P. Center for Street Children in Rwanda, and integrative medicine clinics. We are very blessed to have him here with us today. So, what are we waiting for? Fill up your coffee and let's get started. Well, good afternoon, listeners. I am very excited to have Dr. Gabriel Constans here today. I'm going to tell a little bit about him, but then I am going to allow him to introduce himself and tell everyone why he's here today. Now, first off, he sent me a PDF version of his book, but I loved it so much that I bought my own version of it and highlighted. And I will admit as well, my executive assistant's already ordered a copy because I told her how amazing it was. And I told her I'm going to read two of my favorite quotes that are in the book. One of them I put on my dry erase board. I'm not sure if this is one of your quotes or if you got it from someone else. You can spill the beans on that. But one of the quotes that I love is "Every life matters, including yours. Start acting like it." And the other one is an area where you talk about focusing a lot on preparing for the future. My sponsor says, and you do a lot of future tripping, and I think it's just strategic planning and planning for the future. But one of the quotes that you say when you walk through this is thinking ahead doesn't prepare us for experiencing the present. So with that in mind, Dr. Gabriel Constans has spent the past 40 years working in mindfulness and meditation across a variety of areas, including counseling centers, hospice, bereavement departments and hospitals, businesses, private practices, secondary schools, health and recovery centers, colleges, and post-trauma programs in the U.S. and abroad. What I was really excited, and I really hope we really talk a lot about, is for the past 10 years, he's been teaching in prisons and jails and detention centers throughout California, hoping that you're teaching these meditation and mindfulness skills to inmates so that when they rejoin their communities, they're utilizing these skills in their lives. So now is my opportunity to stop talking. Welcome you to the podcast. Please introduce yourself and tell us why you're here today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm here today. One thing is because you were kind enough to invite me. I really wanted to be on this program because there's such a variety of issues dealing with mental health in general, and then specifically about different areas of mental health. And a lot of things that I've experienced, both personally and professionally, all revolve around those things. No matter how much I get off into writing fiction or screenplays or stories or drama or whatever, it always comes back to being present and trying to be as aware as possible and remembering to be aware. That's always the big thing. Remembering to be aware. We all can do it because it's actually easy to do. But just remembering to do it, and little clues and things we can do to remind ourselves to be aware of what's going on in the moment with our thoughts, emotions, and sensations. Because the more we're aware of them, then we have more choice in our life and we don't automatically react to things. And we can either say something or not say something, do something or not do something, but have a clearer perspective and more of an objective sense of what's going on, as opposed to thinking that we are what it is we're experiencing in the moment. And that can be a huge shift in somebody's life. So I always hope talking about it and being on your show and other shows can help bring that awareness back to myself and as a reminder, and also hopefully to other people.
That is perfect. That is perfect. I was trying to remember. I took so many notes when I read your book. I was trying to think of, there's so many different pieces that you just mentioned. For example, the awareness piece of it. And one thing that I was thinking is you have an acronym, you have a lot of acronyms in your book, which I find are so powerful. I'm a strong believer in acronyms because I think if I can learn an acronym and I can practice it repeatedly, then in a time of stress, if I can just pause and say, okay, what was the acronym? And now use those steps of the acronym to get to the next step of the journey, then it's really helpful to me. So I love acronyms. You have a lot of them in your book. The book that we were talking about, audience, and we can also talk about some of your other writings as well. But the one I'm particularly talking about is A Brave Year, 52 Weeks Being Mindful. And the acronym that you just reminded me of right now is the STOP acronym, which is stop, take a breath, observe, and proceed. And so part of what you were just saying is just, and you also talk a little bit later in the book about being your own meteorologist, talking about like taking a step back and looking at what's really happening in your mind and in your body and being present in those moments and some of those. So I think one of the questions I have for you is what inspired this particular book? Now, tell me this, when I read it, especially it being 52 weeks and reading the intro, this is meant for learning how to be mindful, and the best way is to practice it slowly, repetitively over time. And so each week having a focus area, and you build into this book has focus areas and then exercises that you've outlined within it. So perhaps can you explain to me what your thought was in building this book and how you've utilized perhaps this book and some of your other tools and the curriculum that you perhaps teach when you're going to different centers or different facilities, and what next steps you would outline in that area?
This book mostly came about as a result of some of the changes and things that I experienced of being in state prisons once a week for the last 10 years. And the things that seemed to be most helpful is the most consistent thing, because a lot of the different places that I've practiced with mental health or with mindfulness, in hospice was mostly focused on bereavement and other things. In hospitals, it was with health issues and mental health. And so in different settings, it was never as long as this has been with a group of people over a period of time. And so I kept finding that you didn't need to go in progression. You didn't need to start at one place and then have a whole outline of then by 5 weeks from now or 10 weeks from now, I'm going to be here and be doing this. And that's the next thing. That every single page, every single exercise had to be something that could be utilized and valuable at that time, at that moment, in that day with whoever you were with. That's why it wasn't, even though it says 52 weeks being mindful, it's essentially just having a week, a different thing each week, but those can be alternated at any time because any of them can be practiced in any order. So that's how that came about. And the next thing is actually because there's such a huge increase. I just read some more recent research in the last 10 years in the increase in sadness and helplessness and feeling overwhelmed and suicidal ideation in teens and college students. It's been a huge and dramatic increase in the last 10 years. So actually the publisher and I are right now in the process of working on changing the format of this somewhat, and going to be coming out this fall with a very, very similar and a lot of the same things, but a different format for 14 years old and up, all for being in school and all the different issues of being in school, personally, family wise, past, present, future, and how these things can be utilized in that kind of environment. So that's sort of the next thing of where this is evolved. This came out about a brave year. I don't remember exactly when it came out, half a year ago, 3/4 year ago. It hasn't been out that long, maybe a year at the most. So
Says August 29th, 2023. Doesn't sound right. August 29th, 2023 can't possibly be right because that was just recent like 2 days ago.
that
I
was
just
really
an
good.
advanced
So
copy of it.
the publisher made it sound like it'll always be fresh because it just came out a week ago.
Okay. The real copyright is 2021.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it's been even longer, like a year and a half, 2 years.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. So one of the things I was thinking, so when I was reading through it, I thought, okay, this particular area I really relate to. This area, not so much. This area I relate to. And I want to say to the listeners, one of the things I found throughout my own healing journey, and I didn't record the snippet where Dr. Constans and I were talking ahead of time, but he did ask me a question. I said, what questions do you have for me? And he said, what's the meaning of life? And I said, well, first off, how long do you have, or how short do you have? Because my answer could be one thing this second, and it could be something different 5 seconds from now. And the reason I'm relaying that is because one of the things I really like about skill sets and learning skill sets like this, or having the opportunity to have them available, is that what doesn't necessarily apply to me today on September 1st, 2023, may very well apply to me 6 months from now. And so by reading it and knowing it's available, then I can go back. And I've done that so much in my healing journey. In fact, if you go back and listen to episode 9, Maddie talks about yoga and her healing. And when they tried to talk to her, and she's recovering from sexual trauma, and they said, do yoga. And she's like, I'm absolutely not doing yoga. And then she did yoga. And she said, it was so healing. And the exact same thing on the episode that is coming out in a couple of weeks, we talk about the link of childhood trauma to addiction. And that I interviewed the director at Ripple Ranch. She talked about yoga and individuals who said the same thing. I'm not doing yoga. And then later they did it. So I make that reference is when I read this book, there are some areas that I thought, okay, I can't really relate to that now, but I bet you at another stage of my life, there are areas that I will relate to. There is a particular one that I was thinking about tied to the idea of the computer. The mind is like a computer. If we don't occasionally watch our thoughts, our lives are being pre-programmed. Observing the mind is like turning on a light to see in the dark. I just had a conversation with someone yesterday. He went on this retreat and had this spiritual experience. When he relayed it to me, it was very similar to this. I thought, that's what I think of when I think of as mindfulness. Okay. What would you define, or if you're talking to for the listeners, because one of the things you said in the beginning is the audience that listens to this podcast is very diverse. They come from all walks of life, which I absolutely love. And so part of that is I try and encourage our guests to give definitions and acronyms. Please spell them out because others might not have heard it. And this is an opportunity for them to hear it. So can you perhaps give from your perspective a little bit about how you view mindfulness and meditation, and how you might explain mindfulness and meditation differently based on the audience. For example, how would you perhaps explain it to that 14-year-old or the college student or someone who's struggling in the bereavement in the hospice area or someone who's in jail or prison?
It can be described pretty similarly to all those, actually, in all those situations, but I wouldn't necessarily bring it up or be describing it or suggesting somebody do it in each of those situations at a specific time, depending on what was going on at the moment. When somebody is in the midst of grief, you don't go, oh, stop, be mindful, take a breath, be aware of what's going on. They're very aware of what's going on. In fact, it's so overwhelming, they don't want to be aware of it anymore. To talk about mindfulness, it just means to pay attention. But instead of paying attention as much as we do to what's going on externally, is starting to pay attention to what's going on with our body and mind internally. And that's, as he said, like shining a light in the darkness. A lot of us, I won't say most of us, it's a generalization, a lot of us, including me, get caught in things and situations and events and family and work and things that are going on externally. And many times we forget to pay any attention or be aware of or be mindful. Being mindful is just another word for being aware or paying attention to. Being aware of what's going on with ourselves and what's happening. There's so much takes place within literally seconds when you are slow down, are still for just a moment or two, and whatever acronym you use to do that, or anything you don't use, any reminder to do that, you can suddenly notice right away, like a pain in the knee, a thought about the past, another thought that thought triggers about the future, a thought about that, then a reminder, oh, wait, I'm trying to be aware. And then that thought that just reminded you of that, of then taking a breath and your chest rising and falling, somebody saying something, and you automatically go on this whole script in your head about what that means or doesn't mean, as opposed to it's just somebody saying something, and listening and just listening to what that is in the moment. So it's really just paying attention and taking the time to pay attention and, quote, being mindful to what's happening in the moment in yourself. And that can also be externally as well. There's light right now shining through this window down onto my face as we're sitting here talking. There's books in front of me that are just reminded me that I need to dust at some point because there's a ton of dust on top of them because I never hardly ever take them out to read them. It can be lots of things. There's just so many little things. For example, lots of times when we get angry, it's just an automatic, really quick response. And anger is usually always directed at somebody else or at ourselves. And at ourselves, it's I'm stupid. Why didn't I do that? Why did I do that? What was I thinking? Or it's somebody else. Why did they do that? They're stupid. They're great. They're the mess. They're the reason I'm hurting so bad. It's their fault. So it's either their fault or my fault. But instead of acknowledging them, sometimes paying attention and slowing down and seeing what's reacting in what we're telling ourselves, usually being angry is sort of the last reaction to what's happening. The predominant thing that causes anger, is when we're feeling either sad or helpless. But because we often don't have any control over feeling sad or helpless, we jump to being angry at ourselves or somebody else because it gives us more of a sense of control. Because then there's somebody or something to blame. And to not allow ourselves to feel the sadness and helplessness and just acknowledge that it's there, without trying to get rid of it some way by going and drinking, getting high, doing something else. Or being angry. And some people, we all get caught in those kinds of things we tell ourselves, and that's the story we believe. And when we repeat it over and over and over and over and over, so that then our behavior, you start having behavior that becomes addictive, keeps happening again and again. So it's a way just to stop, to break being mindful and being aware is just is a way to stop, see what's going on, and realize that that's not who we are. It's just what we're experiencing. Whatever we believe is just a belief. It's not who we are. I think I may have gone on a little bit, but that's the best description I can think of for mindfulness, and that can be used in any age group. So for kids, many times for really young kids, you can just talk about being aware of their breath and use animal sounds and bringing the breath in, making a sound, and helping relax once the sound comes out. So
stealing a quote from your book in a second, I have heard individuals struggling with mental health challenges who say they absolutely hate, those are their words, mindfulness and meditation. And I get it. I get it for a lot of reasons. I've been in those shoes. Tomorrow, I could be in those shoes at some point. And the part that I'm going to steal is you have an area where you commented somewhere in the book, mindful meditation takes courage and conviction to look at and see internally and externally what is taking place. And I believe that so strongly because the example you were just given, it is much easier to react with anger or to, as you say, use one of those victim, hero, or villain mentalities to react in that way than to pause and take a step back and begin to bring awareness to your body. Myself, being a victim as a child of physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and then in my kidnapping of that abuse. Actually, Janine, who I interviewed in episode 6, if she listens to this episode, she will die laughing. The first time she told me to think of where do you feel that in your body, I probably said a 4-letter word to her. I probably told her where to stick it and to not talk to me again because I didn't want to feel anything in my body anywhere. I thought she had lost her mind and she was cuckoo. And why in the world was I at this place? And I was at that particular location for eating disorder as a consequence of trauma. And so the idea of me having to think about why I was reacting to something and where I felt it in my body, first off, I'm a biomedical engineer. To me, that didn't make any sense. Now that I know so much more about it, it of course makes so much sense that my body is reacting to stimuli based on years and years of reactions that it's received, and it's taught itself over time. So it makes a lot of sense to me now. And fast forward, I shared a story in episode 13 when Chrissy and I were talking about the link between childhood trauma and addiction. I shared a recent event that happened to me at work. I had a colleague yelling at me in front of my other colleagues, blaming me for something that was not my fault. In that moment, I realized that in my body, my stomach was getting upset. I felt like my temperature was starting to rise. I started to get a headache. I was forcing myself to ground my feet to the ground, to touch my fingertips, to do box breathing. I was forcing myself to use the skills that I had learned in mindfulness and meditation over these 3 years of practice that I could not, there was not a chance in heck I could have done when I first started it. But that took a lot of courage and patience and practice and willingness to try those things. So listeners, if you're listening to this and you think that we are crazy, that's fine. Maybe pause and listen to this next week or the week after, because it has completely changed my life. And in many ways, it has the example that I gave in episode 13 very much changed the way that I behaved in an executive role at my company, because without those skills, I would have reacted out of anger. I would have completely embarrassed myself and made a fool out of myself when I didn't intend to. On top of that, the individual who was behaving that way to me, he is a great human being. He was not doing that to me because he was an evil human being, right? And that's the story. But I love Brene Brown quotes. In fact, and I don't think I've done very many Actually, several guests have talked about Brene Brown, and I haven't. But Brene Brown talks a lot about the story you're telling yourself in your head. And the story I could have been telling myself in my head is he thinks I'm stupid. He thinks all of these things, right? No, it's not. But understanding that whole body part, and you go through an area where you're talking about belly breathing and touch points, using those to bring you back into the present and ground yourself into awareness. And so, listeners, I want to tell you this for a fact, in that very heated conversation in a executive meeting where we were making big decisions, those skills were complete game changers. I want to read a little section of this particular book, and then I really want to hear about some of your other experiences. This is on page 12 and 13 of the book. It starts off with mindful exercises to reduce stress, increase the ability to self-reflect, and learn how to live with internal and external realities, bringing one's attention or awareness to the present moment with intention. So the first part is take a look inside, and it directs you to the exercise area. There is, which is on page 120 later in the book. Everything has a stimulus and response. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lie our growth and our freedom, by Vicktor Frankl, and who's a Holocaust survivor, if listeners, if you're not aware of that. So in this example, you talk about try sitting and closing your eyes for a short time, see what happens. Notice anything that comes into awareness and write it down in your head as if making a note. There is a pain in my butt. There is a thought about mom. There's a sound in the other room. There's my head nodding off to sleep, or dust on your books. Give your inner world some love and attention. There's a lot going on. The next section talks about any place and any time. The part that I love in this area really ties to when I think of myself and my colleagues. We are fast-paced environment, and we live in the myth of multitasking. And so in here, you talk about intend to mindfully listen to and connect with those you live with and encounter throughout the day. While working, just work. While playing, just play. When learning, just learn. When listening, just listen. Give whatever you are doing your full attention at that moment. That is amazing. That is so powerful. And I had to highlight it and write it down. And I've already shared it with many of my friends. I sent it via text message to them. So it's kind of exploding already. But I wanted to share those couple of thoughts, and maybe that whole idea of being courageous to enter into this journey of mindfulness and meditation. So perhaps if you could talk a little bit about the psychology behind why individuals are so fearful of it, and why it's okay to be fearful of it. And it's okay to then move forward, because I think a lot of times individuals may even be embarrassed about being fearful of it and may not want to go down that journey because they don't want to admit they're afraid of it. So I would like to just reduce the stigma of fear around it and open that up. So maybe if we could talk a little bit about your thoughts in that area, that would be great.
Yeah, I really appreciate all the things that you just were talking about and the experiences you were sharing. That was really, really helpful and good reminders for me. There's a reason that most of us are scared to look inside because it can be so intense. At times, it's not always good to do that. And unless you're in a safe place and or have support, it's may not be the time to start practicing meditation yet. But if you are able to, and you don't have to, if it's too frightening or it brings up too much stuff that's too difficult to deal with, you can stop it at any moment and put your attention on something else. It's interesting. There's this book about mindful counseling. There's a bunch of psychiatrists at Harvard and other places that have been using mindfulness in counseling with people, and with all variety of things, anything you can imagine that's going on in somebody's life, or any experience or difficult thing that's happening. And they found that it's much more extensive than than a brave year is. But they found, and they talk about it, which of the practices, which of the paying attention to either your um, a part of your body or something outside yourself, because sometimes it's better to pay attention to something outside of yourself to help ground you as opposed to what's going on inside, because that's something you can deal with in that moment. They found when it's best to do certain kinds of mindfulness. And when I mean kinds, I just mean exercises with different people and different circumstances. So if somebody's disassociated at the moment, you wouldn't say, well, what are you thinking about? Pay attention to your thoughts. It's not what is helpful. So any of the things in this book or any mindfulness practices anywhere are all things that anybody can do when and if they decide to do it. And if it's too scary to do right now, then it's too scary to do right now. And maybe tomorrow, maybe a week from now, like you talked about earlier, in a different situation, you can say, you can try it and say, okay, that's why sometimes it's good just to do it for a couple minutes to begin. And the reason it's called a brave year is because, as you were saying, most of us, to stop and pay attention to what's going on with ourselves, we rarely do. So usually we're running on all these scripts automatically. We're doing what people say we should do. We're living our life. We're thinking it's their fault or my fault for something not happening. We either stay in the past and ruminate over the past a lot and go over those thoughts, or we think about the future a lot, or are anxious about the future a lot, think about that. Or some people are really in the present unfolding. They forget about the time. They don't think about where they have to be in the future. So sometimes it's hard to function living wise, making a living wise doing that. So we all tend to have predominantly in one of those three things. To stop and pay attention to that, the reason it says brave is because it can be hard at first. Like you mentioned, you can try it out just for a couple of minutes. It's not seeing that you're a bad person or that you are horrible or that are these other things or my whole life is screwed because of this and that and I'll never change, etc., etc. It's not because of those things. It's what we tell ourselves, what we're telling ourselves about what it is we're thinking and feeling. That's why it's scary, because what we're telling ourselves can sound really awful sometimes. And it can be really painful if we're having memories about things that are coming up. So that's why the exercises of paying attention to a certain part of your body and just being aware of that part of your body, or paying attention to thoughts or emotions or sensations in the body as if it was weather, it's clouds coming by, or it's animals on a mountaintop and you're the mountain and they're coming and going. Just different ways to be able to step back and look at yourself as if you are a movie as opposed to you are in the movie, that you're watching the movie instead of being in the movie. Because most of the time we're in the movie and we are not directing it or producing it, and we did not write it. We're in the movie of our life because it's become a habit. So mindfulness can take a lot of courage to stop and look at all that. But then as you continue practicing it, you can begin to choose how you react to what you are aware of over a period of time. And maybe sometimes just for a short time. There are many days I'll sit for 30 minutes in the morning. I'll go, oh, I'm going to be really aware of what's going on. Oh, I'm really paying attention here. Oh, I was really aware of stuff the whole time. I'm going to really do this today. And then all of a sudden the evening comes around. Wait, what was I going to do? I was just thinking about this and I got to get this done. And I tend to be in the future all the time. That's where my mind goes more than anything. And I have a sense you do too. Is just my mind is always, what do I have to do next? What's next? What's on my list, etc. And I have to meet with you at 3:00 and for this, it's online meeting and I'm so much there that I'm missing so much of what's going on in the present. I'm missing the really cool thing I just read. I'm missing the really nice smile my wife just gave me. I miss because I'm thinking about the next thing that's coming up. So to be aware of what's going on in the moment takes practice and courage. But the safe and good thing is to know about it. You can take a break at any time and just go back to automatic and give yourself doses of being aware throughout the day. Because even a small amount of being aware of what's happening can start to make a huge difference.
I am thinking of a couple of your quotes, and one of them, I was trying to decide which one should I say really quick. The one that just made me think about when you were talking about not paying attention to, oh, I love the endearing part about the look from your beautiful wife, but it does tie back to the one about being in the present. So in the area of the book where you talk about be prepared, get it together. And so I think a lot about this, but the rest of that section says these can be important messages for planning ahead and doing what's possible, but they can also keep us caught tripping about the future, which can heighten anxiety and keep us vigilant for a surprise. So we can plan and prepare for the future, but not control it, though we may think that's what we're doing. Thinking ahead doesn't prepare us for experiencing the present, which is that last phrase is one thing that I just want to continue to say to myself. Thinking ahead doesn't prepare me for experiencing the present. And I want to experience more of the present for sure. Another one that you mentioned, you talked about the habitual part, and you have a beautiful part in here about habits. You talk about habitual thinking, a personal list of unbreakable rules we impose on self and others. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I think we all have different expectations of ourselves and ourselves, and that's all embedded in us culturally, family wise, what's happened, experiences we've had. So we start to think that these experiences or these thoughts or these beliefs are the only reality that can be lived that way, that we have to be a certain way, we have to do certain things in order to, quote, make it in life, in order to, quote, be a good person, in order to, quote, be respectful. But if all these images and expectations we put continually on ourselves and on other people, one thing I've worked with, an example of that over a long period of time, which I've still gotten better at, but I still do, is when somebody says to me that they're going to do something and then they don't do it, that I was like, no, you said you were going to do that. You told me you're going to do that by this time, at this moment, because for me, when I do things, if I say I'm going to do something, I have this really strong addiction to thinking I have to do it and I have to do it on time. And if I don't, it's never going to get done and nobody else is going to do it. And so then when I trust and depend on another person to do something they say they were going to do and they don't do it, then part of me starts to scream, no, oh my gosh, what? I can't trust you anymore. I'm not, let it go. So every time that happens, it's just none of these are based on reality. They're based on the messages and a script that I've given myself over many, many, many years. So when I've been able to stop and see when I'm doing that and why I'm doing that, then I can let it go so much more and not get caught in the expectations or the future and be more present to what's happening. And also, the old thing about courage to let go of what you can and do what you can and when to know the difference between the two. That's essentially what that is about. It's saying the same thing, but just I said it much more complicated. So.
I'll put it this way. I think you put a different twist on it. And I like to hear things said from a different angle because I believe we as human beings receive things and absorb them and understand them and bring them into our own level of being when we hear them from different angles. So I appreciate that, because I press the mute button when I hear the same thing over and over and over again, because I don't even appreciate it. So when I hear someone say the exact same thing in a different way, I gain a lot more understanding. One thing that you said that really spoke to me was this idea of interpreting things and how we hear them and how we think about them versus what reality is. And one of the things that you said is, in the book, the brain does not say this thought is good or this thought is bad. The brain just thinks. And we as human beings attribute those factors to them. And I strongly believe that I, as a human being, often attribute those factors to my own thoughts or my own actions in a way that is considerably more critical to myself, or maybe even to others, maybe even just tying back to that habitual component of it. Your example of someone not doing something when they should, when perhaps that individual didn't do it because they had some emergency or something happened, right? I don't know. I've decided not Ange's brain, but from an emotional perspective, because of whatever my current filter at that moment is, has decided this is good or this is bad. And when I take a moment to pause and breathe, be present in the moment, and understand that perhaps there's more to it than just that, then I just find myself as a happier, healthier human being. I really just do a deep breath and say, you know what, it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And
I
I love
think,
that.
yeah, I appreciate that. I love, I can hear different things different ways also at different times from different people. And I think sometimes of shifting that from expectation to that's my intention changes the whole thing. I intend to have this done a certain time, or they intend to do something. That's different than saying this will happen at this time, because we can't control the future anyway. So, yeah.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. One of the things that I was thinking as well is, you mentioned perhaps trying some different exercises. And listeners, I do want to say this. I am very passionate about mindfulness and meditation. It has changed my life. And I also, being a scientist, I will not do this, but I could fill up the show notes with scientific research for days on the benefits of mindfulness and meditation in a healthy living. And so, as part of the purpose of this podcast is to educate, to bring healing into all areas of well-being. That's why I'm passionate about this particular topic. And so one of the areas you mentioned was, hey, let's just try a couple of minutes each day. A couple of years ago, I decided, this was 2 years ago, that I was going to start in January every morning doing 3 things. And they were 10 minutes of meditation and mindfulness, my gratitude list, where I list out 10 things I'm grateful for, and then yoga. And I will tell you, I'm a very stubborn individual. And so the first couple of months, I was just like, this is totally not working, but I committed to it. And so that stubborn part of it, I said, fine, I'm going to keep doing it. And about the 3rd month, I could really tell a huge difference in it. But it took that repetition. And I know in episode, it's either in episode 12 where we talk about boundaries, or episode 13, where we talk about using these skills in our normal day in and day out, non-stressful situations, developing them as habits, healthy habits, so that we have them ready during a stressful situation. And I guarantee you, had I not been persistent and stubborn in that period of time and use those skills of that period of time, when I've needed to use them in highly stressful periods of time recently, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So I'm very grateful for that. However, I also talk about, I love Scott in The Motivated Mind, one of my favorite podcasts, talks a lot about don't compare your chapter 1 to somebody else's chapter 10. So if you're listening to this and you think, well, that's great that you love this, but I still hate it, that's totally fine. Keep in mind, when I first started, I hated it as well. And I absolutely refused to close my eyes for forever. I told them I'm a hostage victim. I am not closing my eyes. I don't care what you say. I don't care if all of you close your eyes. I am keeping my eyes open, and I did. And I did for a very long time until I slowly felt, for me, okay, I'm ready to close my eyes. Not because it's required, because it's absolutely not required. There's like no book that you're going to get an A+ on some exam because you now close your eyes. Like, that's not how it works. I decided at some stage that I was getting more out of it, and I was able to center and ground myself more by doing that. With that said, I'm actually kind of grateful I had periods of time that I did it without my eyes closed, because it would have been really awkward in some highly stressful conflict environments if I had sat there and said, wait a minute, I need to like close my eyes while I'm in this work environment argument. Instead, I was able to use those skills that I had used and learned over that period of time when I was terrified to do it and said I wasn't going to, but I was able to do it with my eyes open and gain those skills and gain the benefits of those skills that I slowly gained over time. So I'm grateful to individuals such as yourself who go into, especially the diverse areas that you go into, to teach these skills to individuals to allow them to live the best possible life that they can. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
So a couple of things. I'm passionate about quotes. I've been stealing all of your quotes, so I really hope you have your own personal favorite quotes that you can share before we end. And then secondly, is there something that you really, or a few things that you really hoped we would cover today that we haven't covered? If so, go for it. What do you want to make sure the audience hears today before we end our session?
I think actually what you were just talking about in your experience and continuing to practice was one of the things I really wanted to make sure that can be at whatever pace is best for you. Being consistent in that respect really pays off. It's interesting. People always, sometimes they have this image of when I die, I'm going to be there in my bed. Everybody's going to be around me and tell her how much I love them, and they'll say, "Oh, you have such a wonderful life," and then I'm going to die. The fact is that if you were a jerk most of your life and you were an asshole and you treated yourself badly and other people badly, and you didn't pay attention and you weren't a very loving person, you aren't going to all of a sudden, at the last moment before you die, become a very loving person. People always ask me lots of times, well, how do people die? And I usually say they die the same way they live the rest of their life. And it's the same thing with being mindful, even if it's just for a couple of minutes. And there are different practices that do it with their eyes open continually. Zen Buddhists do that. And partly for the reason that you were saying, because it made it more possible for them during the day to continue being mindful because that's what they were used to stopping and paying attention to what was going on in themselves without having to stop or go away and sit down and close their eyes somewhere. And it's also okay to say stop in a really stressful situation and to leave and go and close your eyes and then come back. I don't care what situation is, and especially if it's something that you feel is threatening to you, you need to do that. Sometimes you need to do that.
And your favorite quotes?
Well, one is the one that you mentioned by Vicktor Frankl, because it's a great description. He was a psychiatrist and he also was a survivor of the Holocaust, and his entire family died in the Holocaust, some at one place and then the others at Auschwitz. And he obviously knows suffering and experienced suffering, the depths of what it can be. And we all have suffering in our lives in different ways and different formats and different experiences. But his description of when he says between stimulus and response, there is a space. And that space is what you and I have been talking about. It's that taking that moment to be aware of what's going on in this space, because our minds and our bodies are just part of this huge space around us. And yet we're so in them and in our ego and everything else, we're so into that we're just acting like puppets going around a lot of the time. So when he says between stimulus and response, there's a space, and that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. The more you practice, even if it feels awful at first and is really difficult, even if it's just for a couple of minutes, the more consistent you practice mindfulness, the more often you will have the opportunity to make choices. Clear choices, not just automatic choices and just reacting. So another favorite thing that applies to me all the time is John Lennon. Life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans. It's part of one of his songs. Oh, it's when he's singing to his son, Beautiful Boy.
Beautiful boy.
Yeah, and he sings to him, and that's one of the verses. And it reminds me a lot that I get so caught in the future so often, making plans that I'm not here in the present with myself or with the person, whoever I'm with, whether it's at work or at home or anywhere.
So just a reminder that whatever you're doing, do it. Focus on doing it. And I want to end with that quote, every life matters, including yours. So start acting like it. Love it. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was such an honor. I thoroughly enjoyed this and I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you so much. Likewise.
You just listened to episode 14, featuring our guest, Dr. Gabriel Constans, author of A Brave Year, 52 Weeks Being Mindful. In this episode, we discussed mindfulness and meditation, the benefits, how to ease into it, that it is okay to be fearful, and it takes a lot of courage at times to be mindful. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Dr. Constans. If you would like to learn more about him, visit his website, www.gogabriel.com, and I've included that information in the show notes. As a reminder, the experiences and advice expressed in this episode are the host and guest's own personal stories and do not represent the opinions of any treatment centers or organizations mentioned. RAN is passionate about opening the doors for all voices and experiences, not just those expressed in any particular podcast. If you want to share your experiences or expertise, we encourage you to be a featured guest by emailing us at podcast@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org or submit a blog post by emailing blog@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. In case you're wondering, every individual working with RAN does so on a 100% volunteer basis. All funds raised go to support the mission. So don't forget to love, not like, our podcast and subscribe. We have some amazing guests booked for future episodes. And when you do so, please also remember to share this with your loved ones and your friends and give us that 5-star rating. When you do, then we are more likely to pop up when someone does a search when they are in need for a healing story or some thoughtful advice when they're struggling. So please pause, take a moment, and share this with someone today. We hope you will also connect with us at www.recoveryadvocatenetwork.org, where you can donate to the mission, read blog posts, and stay in the loop about upcoming events, including our next fundraising auction coming up October 26th through the 28th of this year. If you would like a sneak peek into some available items, contact donate@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. And if you would like to donate items or services, then email us. Make sure you follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Recovery Advocate Network and on Twitter at RAN to Wellness. If this episode was triggering to you, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis Text Line by texting 741-741, and/or if in the United States, dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you're in the U.S. and need additional resources such as shelter, support group resources, transportation, food, and/or safe, confidential path out of physical and/or emotional domestic abuse, call 211 or visit www.211info.org. If you wish to provide feedback, please feel free to leave comments on the episode or email us. Now, back to your coffee.